Hi, everybody. So in order not to waste our class time, I'm going to go through a couple PowerPoints. So the first one I'm going to do here, and then you'll get another screencast-o-matic for the Hamlet information PowerPoint as well. Just to give you a heads up, I only get one take, so I may mess up or make some weird comments in the middle of this, but hopefully that keeps things entertaining. Who knows? This is actually about Elizabethan England and what theater was like in Shakespeare's time period. This is just a review. I know you guys know a lot of this information, so I'm going to try to keep it sweet and simple, or simple and sweet. There we go. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the supernatural. I think you need to understand that Elizabethans, remember, didn't have a lot of science expertise and didn't have a lot of ways to explain things. They very much believed in the supernatural. The first slide here is about man and nature and how they believed there was a direct correlation between what man did and then how that manifested in nature. So they believed that man's actions could have a direct relation. So if people were being really evil, it might lead to a natural disaster. What's interesting, of course, is in the 21st century, there are still some people who believe this, right? People were saying, oh, Houston must be evil, and that's why they had this horrible flood as a result of Hurricane Harvey. That's ridiculous. We know how hurricanes are formed. However, in the Elizabethan era, people didn't, and so they definitely believed that evil in mankind led to evil in nature, and that those things were connected. Back when you were sophomores and you read Julius Caesar, they talk about that a lot. They talk about how blood is running in the streets, and there are lions, and all kinds of other crazy things. Another thing that they believed in were ghosts. They believed that ghosts were actually around. They mostly believed that ghosts were the result of a wrongful death, that someone was killed or someone died too quickly or early or in a bad accident. It could be that the deceased is not content in death, that they have something going on. It could be that they return to right or wrong because they want to relay information. This is particularly relevant to Hamlet because there is a ghost and people aren't sure why the ghost is there and they're trying to figure it out. And a ghost could also be trying to get a person to right the wrong, right, to revenge the death, etc. However, they also believed that a ghost might be a demon that was sent to make a person do really bad things. So maybe it's not really the spirit of the loved one who's coming back to visit you, but instead is actually a demon sent from hell to make you do bad things. And again, that's an important thing for Hamlet to understand and to recognize. This is a picture of the stage at the New Globe Theater in London. I was back there. I was there a long time ago. They were getting ready for a production of King Lear. But this is what the stage looked like at the Globe Theater that Shakespeare ran in this time period. You can see my little tour group down here. I did not hang out with them too much. Instead, I went back and tried to take lots of pictures because I wanted to make sure my classes got to see things. This is what's known as a courtyard theater. And this is what theater was like in the time period. It's way different from going to the theater now. Most of the audience stood, and you actually, sitting closer to this or standing closer to the stage was cheaper than it was to sit far away from the stage. So, and I'll talk about that in a second, but most of the people stood on the three sides. They paid more to sit in balconies or to rent cushions. The cushions at the time, though, were lice-ridden and had lots of bugs and things living in them. Theaters only held about 3,000 people, and they were built entirely of super flammable materials. And so this is why the theater district often went up in flames, quite literally. Again, this is the outside of the New Globe. You can see, though, now they have these cool sprinklers. I don't know if you can see this as I'm doing this, but I hope so. But there are cool sprinklers on it. The City of London didn't want it to be built because they were nervous about it burning again because people had such bad memories. But the elaborate sprinkler system allowed them to do it. These are pictures of the inside. So interesting, this is called the Wheel of Fortune. So when a character was making a big decision, they would often go out and circle around this so that the audience would know what was going on. What's interesting is that going to the theater in this time was more like, sorry, bell, time to go to class. Going to the theater in this time was more like a tailgating event than it was like when we go to the theater. At the theater now, people clap at certain times, they're quiet at other times. In this, people would bring their lunches, they'd be eating. This is how you get the Bugs Bunny cartoons of people throwing food at people on the stage. It actually comes from this time period. People would bring their farm animals and goats and things. People would be talking the entire production, and I'll get into more detail about that in a second. This is actually actually a picture of the really hard benches that people would sit on. And the reason I took this picture is because this top piece right here, kind of interestingly enough, the theater district was on the bad side of the river, just down the street from brothels and things like that. So often what would happen is a local brothel would rent out this top portion, this top balcony, and the women would actually stand up there and wave down to the people who are tailgating below, and they would all have dates by the end of the night. And by dates, I mean, you know, not really dating. Anyway, so kind of a... Anyway, you get what I mean. So this was actually very lucrative to the local brothels to use the theater in this way. And this is why when the Puritans came into power in Parliament, they were disgusted by the theater. They had a lot of issues with it. They believed that people would act out what they saw on stage. They believed that it was kind of this den of iniquity, that women shouldn't be there. There were a lot of rules and regulations that they were trying to put on it. And so Shakespeare, as the theater owner, was constantly trying to stay ahead of the Puritans and make sure that he kept the Queen on his side so that he wouldn't have to shut down his theater due to Parliament. So on stage, as you know, the actors were all male because that den of iniquity thing couldn't let a woman be on stage. They had to overact. This is part of that tailgating thing where they would overact and they would speak to the different sides of the stage. So since there were 3 sides, they would often they would move from one to the next, and they would act to the 3 sides. This is also why most people knew all of the stories that they were going in to see as plays. So they would already know what those stories were. So people knew the story of Hamlet, for instance. In fact, it was a very popular play in the time period. So there was the Spanish tragedy and the Revenge tragedy was a huge piece of this time period, and I'll get into that in the next slideshow. But again, so they spoke to the different sides of the theater, and people caught about 1/3 of the action if they were lucky. They had very elaborate costumes. A play, usually you could finish writing a play and put it into production within 3 weeks. And those of you who are involved in play productions know that's crazy if you're trying to build sets and costumes and the rest of it. So what they would do is they would actually have really elaborate costumes because those were easier to put together and less of the setting. And that's why in Shakespeare's language there's always a lot of information given to you about what's happening and what's around and where they are, because they didn't necessarily use a lot of set design to make that happen. What else can I tell you? I'm almost at the end. Lucky you. So this is actually the stage. This is what's known as the heavens, and they would lower people down through a hole. This is the hole in the ceiling, and they would lower people down, and this way you knew that the character was good. He would come from the ceiling, so this picture down here really should be reversed and turned around because that's the ceiling. But they would come down, and that's how you would know they were an angel or they were sent to give some sort of good information. And they would swing around. Very nice. And then likewise, they had something in the ground, in the bottom, in the floor, in the stage, where people could rise up from the depths. And this was a way that you knew that the character was somehow in hell or kind of evil or potentially malicious. So for instance, when the ghost appears in Hamlet, they talk about, oh, who's this in the cellarage? And this is a reference, of course, to the fact that the ghost is under the stage making the racket and the noise, as though he is potentially a ghost, meaning the spirit of the loved one, or a demon sent from hell to make people do bad things. So just a little bit of information, a short review. Hope I wasn't too crazy. There you go.